They said she was the most bullied woman in the monarchy, but what if the real story was hiding behind the people who quietly walked away? Because here's the thing, nobody wants to say out loud narratives can be scripted, interviews can be staged, reputations can be polished, but staff don't lie with their exits. And when communication secretaries, private secretaries, personal assistants, bodyguards, nannies, and executives all start disappearing one after another, you're not looking at coincidence anymore. You're looking at a pattern that keeps repeating, a pattern that keeps getting denied, a pattern that gets louder every time someone leaves without looking back. And when you line those stories up side by side, something very uncomfortable starts to take shape. Because suddenly, the victim story doesn't sit quite the same anymore. It starts with a man who didn't just whisper behind closed doors, he wrote it down. Jason Knauf, the insider, the one who saw everything up close, without the filters, without the cameras, without the carefully curated image. And in October 2018, while the world was still buying into the fairy tale, he did something no one else dared to do. He put it in writing.
You can't choose just to take the fun stuff in any job. That applies to the prince and princess as well as everyone else working for them. So I wouldn't change anything.
An email, clear, direct, uncomfortable, alleging that 2 personal assistants had been pushed out. Not rumors, not tabloids, not speculation, internal concern. And that alone should have been enough to stop everything in its tracks, but it didn't.
I am very concerned that the Duchess was able to bully 2 PAs out of the household in the past year. We have had report after report from people who have witnessed unacceptable behavior.
Because instead of answers, what came next was silence, strategic silence. And then timing, very interesting timing. That email didn't explode immediately. No, it resurfaced 3 years later, just days before the Oprah interview that would shake the monarchy. Coincidence? Or something calculated?
Fast forward 3 years, and that email was leaked to the media just days before Harry and Meghan's explosive interview with Oprah Winfrey.
I don't know how they could expect that after all of this time, we would still just be silent if there is an active role that the firm is playing in perpetuating falsehoods about us.
And when the narrative hit the world, when the tears, the accusations, the claims of being fed to the wolves dominated headlines, that email was suddenly sitting there like an inconvenient shadow that refused to disappear. Her team called it a smear, a setup, a coordinated attack. But Jason Knauf didn't disappear. He didn't retract. He didn't apologize. Years later, he sat down, looked straight into the camera, and stood by every word.
60 Minutes Australia interview was absolutely fascinating and very well done. What was your opinion on the way Jason Knauf, from a PR perspective, handled the questions lobbed at him about the Sussexes? I have to ask you, this is a man that still works with Prince William under the Earthshot umbrella. Surely he had Prince William's permission to give this interview, and that would be a difficult situation knowing that you're going to be asked about the Sussexes.
Well, he would have been given permission to do the interview. You've got to remember that he's no longer employed by the royal household, so he knows what to say and what not to say. What is quite interesting, that right at the end of that 60 minutes, and I did watch all of it, was that he wouldn't have changed anything.
And that's where the story cracks open. Because when someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose refuses to change their version, you have to ask yourself, what exactly did he see? And more importantly, who else saw it? Because the second you step away from the public interviews and into the private spaces, the story starts shifting, quietly at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. Take the image that was sold to the world, the hands-on mother, the carefully crafted routine, the picture-perfect domestic life, breakfast every morning, school runs, bedtime stories, a life that feels almost too perfect to question.
I do want to show you one other clip of her. She's out still doing her founder podcast.
Oh, yeah.
And she wanted us all to know, as she worked in that clip we ran there, to remind us she's a regular person, Maureen. She's a working mom. So she gets what it's like to be a working mom. Here's the clip.
Before I was a mom, I was like, oh gosh, I'm going to give a speech with a baby on my hip. I had a whole vision. I was like, I'm just going to. And then you fast forward. Granted, I had a lot of external things happening by the time I had both pregnancies and both babies, but it was not the way I envisioned it. For me, it's so important that my kids see me as a working mom.
Oh my God. And that we all see her. as that.
But behind that image, there's another number that keeps showing up. 3 nannies, 6 weeks, and suddenly the picture-perfect routine doesn't look so stable anymore.
But far less is written about the cooks, about the cleaners, about the ground staff, and specifically about the nannies.
Because staff turnover isn't just a statistic, it's a signal. And when the same headline keeps reappearing over years across different roles, across different environments, it stops being a one-off story. It becomes a cycle.
Because Harry and Meghan do not closely care for their own children. They have a phalanx of people who are there to look after Archie and Lily. That's fine, but what is very unusual is that for a couple with so much money, so clearly they are paying above the odds, the turnover in terms of the nannies and other domestic staff is huge. And this is not something new, by the way. I have been across this story since Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's time in the royal family. Look at this. June 2019, I revealed that Harry and Meghan had got through 3 nannies in just 6 weeks.
And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because according to someone who was actually there, someone who signed the agreement, stayed quiet, watched everything unfold, the shift didn't happen immediately. It happened after 6 weeks. 6 weeks of normal. 6 weeks of calm. 6 weeks before something changed. Before the mask dropped. That's the word that keeps coming back. Mask, not misunderstanding, not miscommunication. A shift. A visible change that people who worked closely couldn't ignore. And those people didn't go on record with dramatic interviews. They didn't chase headlines. They left quietly, repeatedly, and every time someone left, the public story stayed the same: victim, target, misunderstood, but behind the scenes, the list of former staff kept growing longer. And then came the defense, the pushback, the claim that everything being said was part of a larger agenda, a smear campaign, a coordinated effort to destroy a reputation before the truth could come out. But then someone else spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to confirm one critical detail: Samantha Cohen, a name that doesn't come with controversy, a reputation built over years, decades inside the system. And when the investigation into those bullying claims was launched, she didn't dismiss it, she acknowledged it. And that acknowledgement alone changes everything. Because now you don't just have accusations from outside voices, you have confirmation that something serious enough to investigate actually happened inside the system itself. And yet, the results? Locked away, sealed, untouched by the public. And that's where the tension builds again. Because if there was nothing there, why seal it? Why protect it? Why keep it hidden until some future moment when someone else decides whether it ever sees the light? What exactly is sitting in that file? What version of the story does it tell, and who benefits from it staying closed? Because while that file sits untouched, the real-time story kept unfolding. New hires, new departures, new explanations, always framed the same way: mutual decisions, not the right fit, timing issues. Because what followed wasn't stability, it was escalation. The exits didn't stop at assistants or advisors, they reached deep into the people hired specifically to protect the image itself. Charlie Gibson and Kyle Boulia weren't random hires. They were brought in to fix perception, to clean up headlines, to stabilize a narrative that was already starting to crack under pressure. Experienced, calculated choices, and still both were gone within days of each other. Not months, not years, days. And suddenly, the people responsible for controlling the story became part of the story themselves. That's where the tone shifts again, because now it's not just about turnover, it's about blame. Because instead of asking why the headlines were happening, the focus turned outward. The communications team was cut loose, positioned as the reason for public failures, as if removing them would somehow reset everything back to control. But when the same problem keeps reappearing after every reset, you're no longer dealing with bad hires, you're dealing with something much deeper. And then comes Emily Robinson, a name that carries weight before even stepping into this environment. Years at Netflix, a track record of stability, not someone who walks away easily. And yet, 4 months. That's all it took. 4 months before another exit added itself to the growing list. And insiders didn't point to burnout or scheduling conflicts, they pointed to something far more intense: a work environment where pressure didn't just exist, it dominated. Early morning messages, constant oversight, a level of control that left no room to breathe. And when someone who built a career on staying loyal decides to leave that quickly, it forces the same question all over again: what changed? Because by now, it's no longer one story. It's multiple stories repeating the same rhythm. Meredith Main steps in with credentials from Google, Hulu, and American Idol, brought in to restore order, to stabilize chaos, to rewrite the narrative that had started slipping. 10 months later, the result is the same. Another Another resignation, another carefully worded statement, another quiet exit wrapped in polite language that reveals nothing and says everything at the same time. And when you stack those departures together one after another across years, across roles, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like inevitability. Then the number hits. 19 departures tied to Archewell in just a handful of years. Not whispers, not speculation. A number that keeps climbing while the public image insists everything is under control. And alongside that number, something else begins to surface, descriptions that don't come from headlines but from lived experience. Words like dictator and high heels don't just appear out of nowhere. They stick because they're repeated, because they resonate, because they match what multiple people quietly experience before stepping away. And while that narrative builds behind the scenes, the public story tries to pivot. Stories of kindness, of thoughtful gestures, of a boss who checks in, who sends flowers, who cares, carefully place counterweights to a reputation that refuses to disappear. But the problem with reputations built on lived experience is that they don't vanish with a press release. They linger, they follow, they grow every time another name joins the list. And then the final piece, James Holt, the last man standing, the one constant through years of change, through every hire, every departure, every shift in direction, present at Kensington Palace, present through the move to Montecito, present while others came and went one after another. The steady presence in a system defined by instability. And when someone like that leaves, it doesn't feel like just another resignation. It feels like a signal. Because if even the one person who stayed through everything decides it's time to go, what does that say about everything that came before? The farewell letter says the right things. Gratitude, pride, optimism, words that sound complete on the surface. But underneath those words sits a reality that's harder to ignore. The system didn't stabilize. The pattern didn't break. It continued right up until the very last name checked off the list.